In this lecture, we will introduce the do-while loop. Let's take a look at the format of a do-while loop. And we're going to see that it kind of looks like a while loop. I mean, the while part is at the end of our statement here, not at the beginning. And then we also have this keyword do in here. So we have do, and then we have our statements, and all the statements here are indented. This is intentional, not required, but it is intentional. And then we have our while and our condition. And also notice that we have a semicolon at the end of our while loop here, our do while loop. And this is required. Unlike our while loops from before where you did not have the semicolon at the end of the parentheses, here you are required to have the semicolon at the end of the parentheses. Otherwise, you will get a compile error. Do here is a reserved word. It is part of the do while loop. It's pretty much required to make this work. That's how Java recognizes that it's a do while loop and not like some other set of statements. So the idea here is that we're going to execute the body of the loop at least once. This is what makes a do while loop different from a normal while loop. With a while loop, we're not guaranteed to run anything inside there. We said in the last lecture that if our condition is initially false, we just skip the body of the loop and we don't do anything with this. But here, this do is telling me we're going to run all these statements at least once. It may be only once, but we know we're going to run it at least some point. We then check our condition to see if it's true or false. So if our condition is true, then we're going to go back to the do part and run all those lines of code again. And then if it's false, we get out. We still need to have some loop control variable in here, and we still need to make sure that our condition eventually becomes false, because we still run the risk of getting an infinite loop. Let's take a look at an example of a do while loop. So here's our example, and as we said before, the way this is set up is we have our do, and then inside the curly braces would be the body of our loop, and then afterwards we would check our condition. So this means that we're guaranteed to run through this loop at least once. In this example, we have our loop control variable I, which is initially 0. So we're going to go inside the body of the loop, and we're going to print out the value of I. So in this case, it'll print 0 for the first time. And then we're going to increment the value of I by 5. So then we go to our while loop and we check to see if I is less than or equal to 20. Well, the first time we run this is going to be true because I would be 5 in this case. So we go back into the body of our loop, and we just keep repeating this where we print the value of I, increment it by 5, and then we just keep going until I exceeds 20. So our output in this case will be 0, and then 5, then 10, then 15, and then 20. So after that, we would increase I by 5, so it becomes 25. Well, 25 is not less than or equal to 20, so the condition of our while loop becomes false, and then we would get out of it and resume the rest of our program. And just as we can write a for loop as a while loop, we can write a do while loop as a while loop. So let's take a look at the exact same example from before, except now we're just using a while loop instead of a do while loop. So we still initialize I to 0, except now we have to run at least one line of the body outside of our while loop. So we got to run this code here once, and then we get into our while loop, where as long as I is less than or equal to 20, we would continue repeating that. So this will produce the exact same output. It's just now that we have to put at least one iteration of the body outside of our loop to make this work. So as I've been saying several times, the key difference here is that we're guaranteed that the statements will run at least once. If our condition is initially false, the other loops would just never run. With the do while loop, if the condition is initially false, we're still going to run through it one time, and then we just never repeat. So a do while loop is actually a really good thing to use whenever we're trying to deal with input validation, because we can ask the user to input something, and then we can check to see if it's valid. If it's valid, then we wouldn't want to repeat back, but if it's invalid, we would then have the user enter it again. Let's take a look at an example of having the user enter in something and we check to make sure it's valid input. So in this program, we're going to ask the user to enter a number between 1 and 10. And because we're using a do while loop, we're going to ask the user at least once to enter the number. So we store that in num, and we're going to check to make sure that's valid. So if this number is valid, which means it should be between 1 and 10, then we don't need to repeat. Or otherwise, we're going to keep repeating until the user actually enters a valid number. Now you might be thinking, okay, wait. We're going to enter a valid number, so it needs to be between 1 and 10. Yet our condition of our loop is going to be that num is less than or equal to 0, or it's greater than 10. Well, remember, we're saying is if we put in something that's valid, so what's considered valid? Well, it's going to be that num is greater than 0, and num is going to be less than or equal to 10. So both of these have to be true in order for this to be valid. So if it's true, we want to get out of the loop, which means our condition of the while loop needs to be false. So this whole thing needs to be false. Well, how do we do that? Well, let's take the negation of it. So it puts some parentheses around it, put an exclamation point. So what is not num greater than 0 and num less than or equal to 10? Well, it's going to be num less than or equal to 0 or num greater than 10. So sometimes we have to be really careful with how we set up our condition in order to get what we want our loop to do. We've now gone over 3 different types of loops. We've gone over our while loop, our for loop, and our do while loop. And all 3 of these loops are useful. You're going to be using them in your programs in one way or another. So the question is, when do we use one loop over another? Well, the way we can do that is just by answering some questions. So you need to ask yourself, do you know how many times you need to run a loop? So if you know how many iterations you're going to have ahead of time, use a for loop, because we can just simply have some variable and keep incrementing it until we're done with the number of iterations. Now, let's say you don't know the number of iterations. So you have to ask yourself, well, is it possible that we could have 0 iterations? So we may need to run something several number of times, but you know that it's possible that you may just not run it at all. That's when you should use a while loop. And if you know that you're going to have at least 1 iteration, but you don't know the number of iterations, then a do while loop is going to be your best option.